As I listened to my favorite song through my headphones, I thought back to a month and a half of rest. The breeze rushed by as I looked out at the fields flying past. I was headed back to my childhood village. I remember when my grandparents would greet me when I was younger and how our cat, Filka, would sleep beside me on the bed. My grandmother used to scold me, saying, "Why do you bring that cat to your bed? He catches mice." But I didn't mind. I loved Filka dearly, just like I loved the homemade food, the taste of fresh bread from the oven, and the homemade cheese, which I still remember as the best I've ever tasted. There were so many great memories, sitting by the fire with friends until nightfall, walking through the forest, swimming in the local lake, roasting potatoes over the fire, fishing with a homemade rod. But all of that is in the past now. The village is slowly dying, and most of my friends have left, though they still come back in the summer. Filka is long gone, and so is my beloved grandmother. She was the kindest, brightest person in my memory. I don't know what happened to her. One summer evening she went into the forest and we never saw her again. The whole village searched, but nothing was found, not even the police. She was listed as missing, and later a court declared her dead. Afterward, my grandfather seemed to age by 10 years in a short time. We tried to persuade him to move in with us, but he refused. My old man is still there waiting for me in that village. As the driver opened the doors and I stepped off the bus, it was about 3 kilometers to my home, but the walk was no burden. I put my music back on and walked down the main street, taking in the familiar landscape. When I saw our home, I hurried toward it. The gate creaked open and my grandfather was sitting on the porch, smoking his pipe. "Grandfather, Lyoshka, my grandson, you've finally arrived." He greeted me, groaning as he got up from the porch. "Grandfather, hello, grandfather," I said, hugging him tightly. We went inside and he offered me tea with mint. "Grandfather, I brewed it for your arrival. Are you hungry?" I didn't want to refuse. On the table were boiled potatoes, pickles, and fried fish. After finishing our tea, Grandfather brought out a bottle of moonshine. We sat drinking, talking about the present, remembering the past, and discussing the future. Grandfather said with a sigh, "Yes, I'll visit them tomorrow. But today, we'll spend time together. I haven't been here in so long, not since Reed was buried." Grandfather sighed again, his voice tinged with sadness. It was quiet for a moment, and we continued talking until late into the night. Finally we went to our rooms. I fell into a deep sleep, finally free from the stress of exams and deadlines. I woke up around noon, feeling completely refreshed. It was great, but I'm so tired from the trip. Grandfather laughed. Though he had grown older and couldn't do as much on his own, I didn't mind helping him. Later that evening, I had to get up and go outside to use the toilet. As I passed the kitchen, I saw Grandfather sitting there staring at the TV. I went outside and did my business, but when I returned, something wasn't right. I saw someone, or something, in the kitchen. It wasn't my grandfather. The figure's skin was pale, uneven, almost like plaster. Its black eyes were leaking something dark, and its face was twisted, with an upturned mouth like a stroke victim's. A cold wave of shock hit me. My body froze. I wanted to move, but I couldn't. I was stuck, staring at it. It was like a dream where you know you should run, but your legs won't move. Then as the numbness faded, I tried to understand what I was seeing. I ran to my room, unsure of how it happened, but I fell asleep almost immediately. Perhaps it was more of a need to sleep than an ability to face the fear from the night. In the morning, I laughed at myself for not recognizing my own grandfather. I had convinced myself that in my half-awake state I hadn't seen him properly. After all, the kitchen was dark except for the glow from the TV. Drowsiness had played its part, blurring my perception. As I sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea, I kept thinking about what Grandfather and I would do today. Yesterday seemed like we'd completed all the major tasks, but in a village there's always something else to do. "Lyoshka, you awake?" Grandfather's voice interrupted my thoughts as he stood at the kitchen door, smiling. "Good morning, Bald Spot. Tea?" "Of course," I said, still half-dazed. "I'll help with the household work today." I already knew what was on my list, working in the vegetable garden, the fields, and visiting the Semenoffs. Grandfather had a way of pushing me to stay active, but I didn't mind. It was all part of life here. "All right then." Grandfather said, his eyes twinkling. Go visit your friends later, haven't seen them in ages. I did my chores as instructed, starting with burning the garden and finishing up with the work in the fields. By the time I was done, it felt like the right moment to visit my childhood friend, Mishka. Growing up, we were inseparable. Either I went to his place or he came to mine. Our days would be spent out on the street, running wild until evening. Today was no different. As soon as we saw each other, we went straight to the beach. Later, we sat at his house, reminiscing about old times, and in the evening, we met up with more friends. There were a lot of us, some still studying, some already home from the army. Naturally, we drank and shared stories. I don't remember how much I drank, but I definitely had too much. I somehow managed to get home later that night. I quietly opened the gate and slipped into the yard, making my way to the toilet. It was time to sleep, I thought, as I left the wooden structure. But as I walked toward the house, I glanced through the kitchen window. What I saw immediately sobered me up. Grandfather was sitting at the kitchen table, eating, but it wasn't like usual. He wasn't eating cooked meat. He was tearing into raw flesh with his teeth. Blood dripped down, and pieces of raw meat flew in all directions. It was hard to chew, but he didn't stop. He shredded the meat and swallowed it in disgusting gulps. I stood frozen, nausea rising in my throat. I leaned against a tree and vomited at my feet. What was going on? I wanted to confront him, demand answers, but something stopped me. Maybe it was better to wait until morning. There was something wrong, and I had to figure out what. Perhaps he was sick and didn't want to tell me. Maybe I could help him. I went into the house thinking about the bizarre sight. As I passed the kitchen, I noticed Grandfather washing a rag over the sink. The table was clear, except for a few faint drops of blood on the white towel. He must have missed washing it off when he was done. Go to bed, or you won't be able to get up in the morning, Grandfather said, but I barely heard him. I was still in shock. That night sleep didn't come easily. I was too tired, but when I did sleep, it was fitful. I woke up early the next morning to find Grandfather already up, sipping his tea on the porch. Good morning, he greeted me, his voice soft. Let's go to the market today. Grandfather, I need to talk to you, I said, my voice unsteady. Talk? What's going on? I took a deep breath. You were eating raw meat last night, and then you came to my room standing over my bed making strange sounds. Grandfather looked down, his expression changing. He seemed saddened, as if something weighed heavily on him. I've become crazy, Leosha, he said softly. The years are taking their toll. Without Rita, I don't know how to go on. I'm living here like a savage. The doctor gave me prescription pills, ones I can't drink with, and they make my head feel like it's in a fog. His words hit me hard. I didn't know what to say. He was struggling in a way I hadn't understood before. I'm suffering from it, and I know it sounds strange, but I'm just not the same. I didn't want to tell you, but I've become someone else. I felt a pang of guilt. I had misunderstood him, been frightened by his strange behavior. It's okay, Grandpa, I said, placing a hand on his shoulder. I'll come visit you more often. I didn't realize how hard this must be for you. His face softened and he looked at me with warmth in his eyes. Really? That means a lot to me. And if you ever come to my city, you're always welcome. I nodded. I'll make sure to visit more. Don't worry. It was clear that my grandfather was struggling, but I knew I had to be there for him, no matter how strange things seemed. Oh, do I even matter to anyone? I muttered to myself. I shook off the thought. By the way, what are we doing today? I asked my grandfather at breakfast. He didn't push me to do much that day, so I went to visit Mishka again. We spent the day together, and in the evening his family grilled shashlik and insisted I stay. How could I refuse? I stayed until late at night. By the time I got home, it was past 1 in the morning. Grandpa was already asleep, but I wasn't tired. I collapsed onto my bed, scrolling through my phone, hoping sleep would come soon. I put on my headphones so I wouldn't disturb him and lost myself in videos. About an hour later, my eyelids grew heavy. I turned off my headphones, rolled onto my side, and was just starting to drift off when I heard movement. Footsteps. Grandpa. I assumed he was heading to the toilet. But then, from my bedroom window, I saw him, not heading to the outhouse, but briskly walking down the street. What the hell? I sat up, suddenly alert. Where was he going at this hour? Without thinking, I jumped out of bed, hastily dressed, and ran outside. I wanted to call out to stop him, but something in my gut told me not to. Not logic, not common sense. Something deeper. An instinct. Grandpa walked straight to the edge of the village. There was nothing there. No stores, no relatives, no friends. Only the old cemetery. I felt my breath hitch. A cemetery? A sick feeling twisted in my gut. I knew he wasn't well, but this was something else. I decided to follow him, keeping my distance. Maybe it was some strange ritual, maybe some old superstition he had suddenly latched onto. But no, it was far, far worse. As he reached the graves, his posture changed, his whole body contorted, and his face, God, his face, twisted into something inhuman. His eyes darkened, black pits sinking deep into his skull, his mouth stretched unnaturally, his skin uneven and lifeless. This was not my grandfather. Then he dropped to all fours and began to dig. My heart pounded like a jackhammer, sweat beaded on my forehead, my stomach twisted so violently that I nearly collapsed. And then, he broke through the coffin lid. He reached inside and pulled out the corpse, sinking his teeth into its decaying flesh. I don't remember much after that. I turned and ran like my life depended on it. My legs barely carried me, weak and trembling, but I forced myself forward, out of the cemetery, out of that nightmare. I had to get out. But there was no way out of the village at night. The buses wouldn't run until morning. I spent the night awake, terrified. I knew now this wasn't an illness. This wasn't some delusion of an aging man. This was something else. When the first bus arrived, I didn't hesitate. I packed my things and left without looking back. I didn't care what that thing pretending to be my grandfather thought. I just knew I had to get away before it decided I was next. As the bus rumbled further from the village, the fear slowly faded, but it never disappeared entirely. I arrived home exhausted, feeling hollow. I threw my bag in the hallway, walked straight into the kitchen, and lit a cigarette with shaking hands. Nothing made sense. I waited for a call from the village. I expected anyone to call me, maybe Mishka, maybe someone asking why I disappeared so suddenly, maybe news about my grandfather. But no one called. A day passed, then 2, then a week. Only Mishka messaged me, asking where I'd gone. I made up some excuse about urgent business. 2 weeks later, everything changed again. I was scrolling through social media when a headline caught my eye. A human skeleton had been found in my village. The body was fresh. Meat still clinging to the bones, blood still staining the earth. Forensics determined that the victim had died only a couple of days ago. The villagers blamed a wild animal, but I knew better. It wasn't an animal. I felt sick. My hands trembled as I read the reports. It was on multiple news sites. It wasn't fake. Memories rushed back. Grandpa sitting in front of the TV, gnawing on raw meat. Him standing over my bed in the middle of the night. The graveyard, the corpse. I barely made it to the bathroom before vomiting, and then another realization hit me. He knew where to find me. I had to leave. I grabbed my bag and stuffed it with whatever I could. There wasn't much money, but I could afford some rundown apartment on the outskirts of town, just enough to disappear for a while. My parents were still on their business trip. They wouldn't be back for months. I wasn't going to call them, not yet. This wasn't something you explained over the phone. I'd tell them when they returned. For now, I just had to run, before he came looking for me, before it did. In the dead of night, I was suddenly jolted awake by a sharp trill of the doorbell. My heart raced as I sat up in bed trying to make sense of the situation. Was it a dream? But before I could gather my thoughts, the bell rang again. I was about to storm out and give whoever was ringing the doorbell a piece of my mind, but then I glanced at the clock. It was past midnight. My pulse quickened. I had to remain as quiet as possible. Who in the world would be coming to visit me at this hour? I approached the door, cautiously unlocking the chain. When I saw who stood there, I froze. It wasn't my grandfather, not the man I knew. It was something else, something wrong. The creature standing on my doorstep had black, soulless eyes, pale white skin stretched unnaturally tight across its face. The voice that spoke was unmistakably Grandpa's, but distorted, as if something had overtaken it. "Grandson, open up," it said in his voice. I backed away from the door, fear coursing through me. I quickly locked the room door behind me, wrapped myself in the blanket like a child hiding from the world, and waited in silence, hoping the nightmare would end. The bell rang a few more times, each chime made my skin crawl, and then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything went quiet. I realized I couldn't stay here any longer. It was time to leave. The next day I found a place. A small, run-down apartment on the outskirts of town, far enough to distance myself from whatever that thing was. The place was a dump. Ancient plumbing, dried-out wooden frames, creaky floors. The furniture was nearly non-existent, but at least the cable worked. The landlord was a puny old man who could barely stand, let alone fix anything in the apartment. He took my money, handed me the keys, and left without saying another word. I started cleaning the place immediately. It felt good to occupy my mind with something practical. Time flew by as I scrubbed and tidied up, and before I knew it, the evening had arrived. Finally, everything was sparkling clean. I sank into the couch, exhausted, but relieved. I wanted nothing more than to lie there and forget everything. I grabbed my phone, settled in, and started watching short videos. Just as I was starting to relax, a new message notification popped up. It was from Grandpa. The text read, "My blood ran cold." The sender was unmistakable. It was. I felt the room close in around me.